Alrighty, well, we're gonna get going. So hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue and welcome online or in person to Concordia University's fourth space. Thanks so much for joining us for Climate Change and the Forest, Real, Imaginary, and Virtual. I'll of course be passing it on to our moderator and panelists in just a second to introduce themselves and contextualize this event, this conversation a little bit further. But first, I wanted to let you know that we are streaming to YouTube live from Concordia University's fourth space, which is located on unceded indigenous lands here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Nous reconnaissons la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. And we make this acknowledgement to bring awareness and understanding of the history of indigenous peoples and their territories that we occupy. At Fourth Space, the space that you're in now, virtually or in person, we work with faculty, students, and staff at Concordia to activate the ongoing research projects and initiatives with the goal of co-creating knowledge and building community. And we do so by producing these daily hybrid events, activities, workshops, conversations, panels, etc., all of which are free and open to the public. This week, we are working with Elastic Spaces, who are bringing people together around the Thinking Loud project, and who invite your active participation. So if you're joining via Zoom, you're more than welcome to jump into the conversation during Q&A periods with a raised hand and turn on your camera, pop in the screen, and we'll call on you. If you prefer to put your thoughts and ideas into the chat, no problem, you can do so, and we'll be sure to read them out for everyone to hear in the space. And if you're joined us as audience members live in the space, once again, just let us know that you'd like to speak, and we'll get one of these microphones to you so that the folks on Zoom can hear you. That's it from me. Without further delay, I'll be passing the floor now to Gisèle Trudel from UQAM to get us started. Hi, Gisèle.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for everyone who's in the room and also online. A big shout out to the Elastic Spaces team, Jorge, Santiago, Lila, working on this for many months, many years even, I think, and it's wonderful to be able to be with everyone here today. And thank also to the the Fourth Space team, because I think this is a wonderful occasion. So we'll be hearing from Yves Mayrand about old growth forests in BC. We'll also hear from Natasha Lavdovsky about ecological reciprocity and artistic interventions. Shelley Ouellet, machine-embroidered landscapes. Kathleen Vaughan, walking and the St. Lawrence River. And also with John Latour, who is a respondent, and I'll also be presenting. And you can read everyone's bios in the online if you choose to. So I'll just get going. So I'm presenting a video. It's 10 minutes long, and I'll also be the timekeeper today. So I made sure that my time was actually 10 minutes. So share sound, and I won't be speaking through this. So I'm just gonna get it going. Okay. Try to mix it up and not have so much voice, human voice in this project. So I'm going to stop my screen share, which I did already, and now it's on to you, Yves. I'll let everyone know a minute before the 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Sorry for a slight delay. So I'll be very careful not to exceed the time. First of all, I express my gratitude to First Nations for sharing with me and others the land where I reside, which is known as Victoria, the land where I'm standing right now. Thanks to Leila Sougir and her team from Concordia for inviting me to this panel. I hope it's not going to be too disappointing or too boring. Before I start, here's an advisory, Hollywood movie style. So Fairy Creek is not a fairy tale. This presentation is partly virtual, but definitely not imaginary or a work of fiction. Some images and language may be disturbing. Viewer reaction is advised. So what is the battle for? What are we talking about? Here's a poster that's roadside coming from the airport in Victoria to downtown. It's about the clear nexus between forest depredation, loss of biodiversity, climate change, and lasting environmental damage. And what we're having right now is known in BC as talk and log. So much talk and no action, and logging goes on. And we're talking about trees that can reach the venerable age of over 1,800 years. So these trees, very large, very old, are they decadent, as the forest products industry calls them, or are they priceless heritage? Well, there are few remaining primary and old growth forest groves and intact watersheds in BC, and they are truly and totally irreplaceable. So you can't replace very centuries old trees with monocultures of quick growing spruce and say that that's sustainable. You are in fact destroying these precious groves, and there are very few of them left, and you're threatening the ecosystems that they support. So what are we in fact talking about? Is it that massive? Is it that much of a problem getting to finally permanently protect those remaining groves? And there's less than 1.5% left of what used to be there before the settlers came in. So here's a map, and you can see some little tiny red blotches. These are the priority deferral areas that were recommended for immediate deferral by a panel of specialists. It was called the technical panel, and they made their report back in 2021. So they're intact watersheds as well. There's a few more of those, but you can see in the southern part of British Columbia, and particularly you can see in the lower part of Vancouver Island. Well, trying to locate Fairy Creek, it's that little green blotch. There's the last remaining undisturbed watershed in the whole half of Vancouver Island. Now, should we have just temporary logging moratoria? They usually last for 2 years or less. You're never sure if they're going to get renewed. If so, for how long? We just have an example. The actual Fairy Creek old growth deferral order was just renewed in extremis before it was about to lapse on June 8th. And it's only for a little over a year and a half. So my submission is that we need permanent protection. That's enough talking about temporary moratoria. We have the maps, we know exactly where the groves are located, etc. We've had 5 decades of struggle about old growth, 5 decades going back to the 70s. So I've put in a few milestones there. If you're interested, you know, there is a book back there on the display. It's called Big Trees, Not Big Stumps. And there's a chronology there of many pages on all of these events, but some milestones. For example, protecting old growth in Haida Gwaii, it goes back to 1974. The Clayoquot Sound and the War of the Woods, Mears Island. Well, we have a tribal park there. It's just because people protested. You know, the Great Bear Rainforest, there's still logging going on there, but at least there is some measure and a particular agreement applicable to that area. Now, the latest one is what is known as Adaitch Ferry Creek, and that's from 2020 to present. How does the battle go? Well, with respect to Ferry Creek, it's an ongoing battle. It's not going with blockades and that sort of thing, because there have been literally many hundreds of arrests, and there are still people going through the court system. I have to say that what has been used there is essentially a paramilitary force of the RCMP to enforce a court injunction against the protesters, and they were peaceful protesters. There was no violence there. A lot of them have been criminally prosecuted. So we're talking criminal contempt of court with the implication that we are criminalizing well-intended citizens who feel very strongly about this issue, who feel that nothing has really been much achieved in a permanent way for decades. So the latest court battle, there are many of them still going on. The latest court battle is a court case launched by a nonprofit society called the Ferry Creek Society. And that battle revolves around the international treaty obligations and the federal legislation on species at risk. Because the marble murrelet is a migratory bird, it's threatened, it's covered by this treaty and the legislation, and its habitat is being cut down, clear cut on the coast of Vancouver Island. Now, where do we go from here? Well, there's a lot of talk about you know, being responsible to be in community with First Nations, and they have knowledge, they have stewardship, and they have guardianship. It has been taken away from them, and it has been taken away with the land. And most of the land claims, of course, remain unresolved to this day. So I believe, and I submit, that Indigenous people are the way to go in ensuring that there is effective and lasting protection for these remaining old growth forests. I have a 5-point strategy, which I won't expand. If people are interested, you will probably get the PowerPoint. We have to act now in unison, and there are a lot of demonstrations coming forth in the next little while. So let's persevere, let's be determined, and let's be constant gardeners. We can't think that it's something that we deal with every 4 years when there's an election. So I close on this here, the past or the future, the choice is obvious. Look at the left, look at the right. So there you go. Please react and act. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Yves. Thank you, Yves. Under the time, and also it would be great to come back to the 5 points in the discussion. I think that would be quite relevant. And what about middle instead of left and right? Where is our middle ground to work with? But we can talk about that later. Alors, we go on now to Natasha Lavdovsky, who is online, discussing ecological reciprocity in her artistic interventions.
Hello, great to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to go about 40 seconds over. I apologize for that. So I would like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Silks First Nation at the Similkameen Artist Residency. And unless otherwise stated, everything I will show you today was created in Pacheedaht First Nation territory on so-called Vancouver Island, where I've lived since August 2020. Soon after I moved back to the island, the Fairy Creek blockade began. The general goal of those involved in this movement was to prevent logging companies from cutting down the ancient forest in the Fairy Creek watershed, the last intact, unprotected old growth valley on southern Vancouver Island, as well as halting logging of other nearby ancient forests in Pacheedaht and Ditidaht territories. Fairy Creek ended up becoming the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history, and the complicated internal politics within the Pacheedaht First Nation Band Council and hereditary leadership creates a tricky situation for Indigenous community members who are against the logging of old growth in their territory. That being said, there was a strong presence of Pacheedaht land defenders at Fairy Creek who were fighting to uphold their sovereignty. The carbon storage capacity of ancient forests and their soil is enormous, and science proves that conserving these forests is essential to reducing the severity of climate change. I went to Fairy Creek initially for many reasons, one of which was to work on an interdisciplinary lichen chemistry sound project with the Canada Council grant. Early in my research, I discovered the at-risk old growth speckled belly lichen on a fallen ancient cedar at the edge of a clear cut. And this spurred a long fieldwork intervention. Performing science, I surveyed every tree in the proposed cut block, collected lichen data, and shared it with the Pacheedaht Band Council, the colonial government, the logging company for the area, the Forest Practices Board, the press, and environmental groups. And I gave public talks about my findings. And it turns out that I'd found the largest population of this imperiled lichen documented thus far in so-called Canada, and the logging company had already cut down much of its host forest. This information has been since used by scientists and advocates as evidence of BC's complete lack of biodiversity protection legislation. After the RCMP raided blockade headquarters at Fairy Creek, the logging road up to the lichen forest was blocked by forest protectors, and it was weeks until I was able to hike the long trek up to continue my research. So I started doing frontline journalism to help maintain the safety of the blockaders, hoping that with more cameras around, the RCMP might be less violent. After weeks of documenting the tactics of forest protectors, I returned eventually to the old growth lichen forest, sadly to hide in the shadows and capture videos of the loggers cutting down ancient trees that happened to be hosting the rare speckled belly lichen. About a year after Fairy Creek ended, I witnessed the forest beside my house get cut down and the subsequent burning of logging waste. Slash burning, as it's called, is a government-sanctioned practice to remove non-commercially viable post-clear-cut logging wood waste. Witnessing this destruction near where I live, combined with the unprecedented wildfires, heat waves, floods, and droughts that we experienced within 18 months, has produced a sense of urgency that has shifted my priorities as an artist. Although my art practice has always looked at our relationships with so-called nature, the ecological grief that I felt since being at Fairy Creek has motivated me to focus more on integrating practical acts of care for the environment into my art practice. My thesis research began when I tried to salvage moss from my neighboring forest before it was cut down. I transplanted the moss underneath a few trees that were left standing along the edge of the creek, but after the forest surrounding the creek had been cut, this usually cool, moist microclimate was ruined. This and the unseasonable autumn heat and drought caused the mosses to not survive the new conditions, even though I watered them almost every day. So I tried again about 2 months later after the rains had returned. I used the colonial government's mapping tool, iMapBC, to find a patch of forest that was pending approval for logging about a few kilometers from my place. So between November and April this past winter, I dug up 30 square meters of moss and carried it out of harm's way to a creekside 50 meters from the logging boundary. I named this intervention and the video documentation of it biosphere, a scientific term for the micro ecosystem in and around mosses with their bryophytes. My performance creates imagery that questions our extractive relationship with the more than human world, and the hazy boundary between an act of care and an act of harm. Whether or not the viewer knows that this forest is about to get cut down, my gestures embody a partial truth that humans could be monsters when viewed from the perspective of non-human beings. However, by transplanting these mosses, rather than taking them to exploit, I'm engaging in reciprocity, not extraction. Artistically, I'm curious about what it means to leave a trace on the landscape that alludes to both destruction and stewardship, depending on the context and depending on how you look at it. The final installation of transplanted moss, called Moss Salvage Circle, is an oval patch of living mosses and shrubs. And from the perspective of the camera, the oval appears as a circle. Circle is both a signifier of a human intervention in the forest, as well as a trick for the human eye, to make a point about shifting perspectives and things not always being what they seem. The act of moving mosses prolongs their life since they would otherwise die in the exposed post-clear-cut logging landscape. Additionally, by placing some of the moss around tree bases, these bryophyte blankets insulate the tree's root systems, covering the surface area above where much of the underground mycelial symbiosis is happening. This intervention is helpful to the forest since it has been scientifically proven that fungal mycelium is richer underneath carpets of feather moss than in surrounding bare forest soil. The 30 square meters of moss that I saved only contains a meager 1.5 kilograms of carbon. Compare that with the estimated 1.5 million kilograms of carbon that gets released into the atmosphere when a 19-hectare forest is clear-cut, like the moss's original home seen here. I also transplanted dozens of baby shrubs and 9 hemlock seedlings. If 3 of these hemlock seedlings reach maturity, let's say 150 years from now, they will capture approximately 30,000 tons of carbon over that period of time. Based on my environmental impact calculations, in order for the biosphere project to be carbon neutral, these mosses, shrubs, and seedlings would have to absorb around 350 kilograms of carbon within the next year, which is impossible because most plant biomass has a carbon content of around 50%, and the weight of the moss, seedlings, and young shrubs won't be more than a few kilograms at best in a few years. The CO2 entering our atmosphere right now is what needs to be sequestered now. And this is why most carbon offsets that are based on reforestation are complete rubbish. In keeping with my concerns about climate change, I chose to not fly back to Montreal to share my thesis project at Concordia, and instead I posted it online and hosted a local screening in Pacheedaht territory. Biosphere was publicly screened on Earth Day in a forest at the start of a logging road 3 kilometers downhill from where it was shot. In attendance were songbirds, low-hanging mist, loggers, local forest protectors, surfers, artists, musicians, and biologists, all of whom contributed to a rewarding discussion session after the screening. I rented a projector and I ran it through an inverter connected to a battery that I powered from the local hydro dam. The film was projected onto a screen that my sister, mother, and I sewed from a large sheet of leftover Tyvek that I purchased from a local builder. And the idea that there might be limitless creative possibilities for ways that we can help our local ecosystem through art and community engagement is very exciting to me. Ecological interventions can be a way to give back to the land, as well as a way to reduce our climate anxiety. We only have so much time to collaboratively address the climate emergency, and I personally want to feel like I did everything I could to help while I could. So I've also been working on a series of invasive plant removal circles, another artistic intervention series that unifies ecological reciprocity and aesthetics. The empty space of these invasive plant circles relates to both the removal of the flowers and the displacement of the native ecosystem. They signify that something is missing, and there was already something missing before the flowers were removed. This month in Lekwungen and Wasanich unceded territories, I cut Scotch broom, a plant which is especially harmful to endangered local meadow ecosystems, which for thousands of years have been stewarded by the local indigenous peoples, providing them in turn with a richness of food and medicine. Scotch broom is alleliopathic, meaning it releases toxins into the soil, preventing native plants from growing. Removing invasive plants is most effective when you start at the edge and work your way in. However, my purpose here is to be more didactic, using the circular shape to draw attention of passersby. Doing these interventions in public spaces is a form of social practice art, creating opportunities for community engagement and conversation building. Although removing invasive plants is not a perfect solution and brings with it all sorts of problems, supporting native ecosystem recovery is another potent remedy to ecological despair. And going forward, I hope to involve other people in these interventions as a sort of group healing exercise, symbiotically healing with the land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That's fascinating what you've been working with, the notion of the circle, but also I think with the gap that it produces. We're going on now with Shelley Ouellet, and please go.
Thank you to everybody here at Elastic Spaces for all your work putting this together. First, I'd like to start off with, I start off with an image by Lauren Harris. I am more of a backwards looker. I'm looking at how images have sort of informed a national identity that makes it very difficult for artists like Tasha to do work, or for work like Yves' group have been doing, because we have this image embedded into a national psyche. Sorry about that. Maligne Lake, Jasper Park is near where I'm from in Alberta. And I've been working with images of landscape and how these images have been used deliberately to brand an identity, a very colonialist, pro-industrial identity of what is Canada. I say that this is deliberate through my research. I have found that the prominence of members of the Group of Seven is no accident, that it, particularly during the Second World War, images of Canadian landscape like this Lauren Harris Maligne Lake were distributed all over Europe to military hospitals, bases, diplomats' offices, to remind the boys of what they were fighting for back home. So this image that was created in the 20s really had a second life during the Second World War. And then this became such a popular program with all of these images from various artists making images of these unpeopled landscapes of Canada. This became a program, public art, and also art education. So these are some images. The images after the war were distributed across Canada to schools, post offices, hospitals, fire halls, and the National Gallery also provided didactics. So many folks that grew up in small town Canada grew up seeing these images and being indoctrinated with this idea of Canada as this large territory that belonged to anybody, sort of perpetuating this discovery myth over and over again. This becomes what is sold internationally, our vision of the nation. And so in my work, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to look at how these potent images, particularly this image of the reflection, the crystal water, the heaven on earth, this sort of vista is now being used by folks in resource extraction. They are using images that are of plants embedded in the landscape to try and make the appearance of a natural extraction. And because we are indoctrinated with these images, there's a belief that we have unending supplies of nature. And this nature is highly constructed. I think about yesterday's talk where Sylvia Hamilton talked about he who has the camera frames the narrative. And I think we know that the Canadian narrative since Confederation was really framed by he who holds the paintbrush. And as the railway went across the nation to sort of seal the Dominion, painters painted the landscape and sold these kinds of images. So in my work, I've been trying to look at contemporary images and images of the past. This is a digital embroidery that was made here at Concordia on a Tajima, which is a large industrial embroidery machine used for mass reproduction. And this is a composite image of Tom Thompson's Jack Pine, combined with an image of an oil spill that I've seen used over and over again by a photographer named Chris McIntosh, sorry. I made a composite of the images, so they're flipped together like playing cards and repeat the image over and over again. And what I was struck by the stock photography image, it used that same sort of the lone pine struggle that rather than showing the expanse of an oil spill, it was a small contained image. And it was used to illustrate a number of different stories about oil spills. This is a detail of some of the embroidery. I've been using the color of an oil spill in the threads, or perhaps the color of a bruise. The Tajima is working kind of against the software in its embroidery. So there's a bit of a frenetic energy to the embroidery, but also there's a bit of a painterly movement in the details of this embroidery and the ones that I've produced. This is an image from the Suncor plant in Fort McMurray, and the photographer that was hired by the company, again, has used this heaven on earth vista, trying to embed the bitumen plant into the landscape as if it were natural. So what we're seeing is a doctored image, but the original is the fact the plant reflected in the tailing ponds. Even the cloud plume is quite highly constructed and very romanticized in a lot of ways. So I've repeated that image in a diptych, and I'm working with textiles, black velvet. I'm putting these embroideries on black velvet. I want to play with the textile qualities that are both attractive and repellent at the same time, that have sort of an idea of luxury and kitsch simultaneously, and to really talk about this battle between the economics and the ecological realities of these sites. Here is a detail of the stitching again. Another site that I've looked at is Hibernia. These oil wells are 25 years past their due date. So it's not a matter of if they have a disaster, it's when. And what was striking to me was that these photographs were taken as if it was a Hawaiian sunset, that these images reflected in the water are truly, again, romanticized. And I really see this as a link back to how images of the landscape are embedded into our psyche. And so to place oil wells in this context kind of softens them, makes it easier to digest, so that when we see images like Tasha was just showing in her great presentation, we see images of man-made posters and banners that seem almost repulsive, where this seems kind of natural. So I think there's a real power in images that I'm trying to challenge in my work. So again, I've done diptychs with this to repeat the work, to talk back to this level of indoctrination. And there's another detail. This is another detail where the Tajima machine and the digital technology, I sort of allow the digital technology to read the image as well. So this is a variation on that image. And then I'll finish off. These are small pillows that recall tourist pillows that were around in the 60s and 70s of various locations. Exshaw is on the way out to Banff. And again, Banff is where I grew up, very highly constructed access to nature, well-groomed paths, parking lots, and this is accessing nature. As you drive out to Banff, you pass the Exshaw Lafarge cement plant, and in my lifetime, I've seen a mountain disappear for cement. The plant was built in the 1920s, and so it's shockingly close to the highway. All of a sudden, you're going through the beautiful mountains, and bang, there's this Lafarge plant. The image that I'm using here, repeated on the pillows, is from the Lafarge plant website, where they really present the plant nestled into the mountains and very romanticized. So I've created a series of pillows, these objects that are to take away very much the way that we've taken away the mountain. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentations, everyone. We're moving now on to Kathleen, and I can kind of see something emerging, what seems to be natural in image making. I think this can be discussed with the group. Also the question of what is nature? It's such a huge topic, but I think it becomes, are humans in nature, part of nature, or is nature out there? And I think that begins to share a discussion that we can talk about care, and we can talk about a difference in other ways if we're in nature and not of nature necessarily. Okay, Kathleen, thank you.
Thank you, Giselle, and thank you, Leela and team, for having me be here today with you all, and beautiful, thought-provoking images and ideas. I'm Kathleen Vaughan. I've written a script to try to keep myself to time, so I will do my best to do so. I'm an artist and professor of art education at Concordia University, where I hold the Concordia University Research Chair in Art and Education for Sustainable and Just Futures. I create studio-based artwork and facilitate art in community settings, since I am profoundly interested in people's stories and the ways they wish to tell them through language, images, and materials. My work for the past 20 years has been place-based. That is, I use place as a lens through which to see the world and engage a wide range of issues: environmental, cultural, historical, social justice-oriented, natural history-oriented, and more. Of course, as a place-based artist, I acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation here in Montreal, and a lot of my work is sited here. My work is not about the forest, but about a different kind of dense, varied, complex, and challenging system, the river, specifically the St. Lawrence River. My research emphasizes the realities of the river around Montreal, but is also oriented to its full 1,200-kilometer flow from Lake Ontario through to the Gulf. I'm interested in humans' relationships with the river, how they have changed over the years and are still changing. But I am also compelled by the St. Lawrence as a dynamic, extraordinary ecosystem, a living entity that we have the capacity and responsibility to care for, urgently so in these times of climate change. I developed learning with the St. Lawrence after 10 days as an embedded artist aboard the Lampsillis research vessel during the summer of 2018, while scientists sampled water and fish along the river from Montreal to Trois-Rivières. Watching them work, I felt the limits of my knowledge about water science and wanted to bring our modes of knowing together as a way of addressing complex river questions. Learning with the St. Lawrence team includes artists, scientists, including my 3 shipmates from the Lampsillis, François Guillemette, Gilbert Cabanin, and Lizzie Grader, and a curator on work funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and Concordia University. Our project includes interdisciplinary knowledge sharing between team members, public outreach events, and research creation. As data, we're developing artwork and collecting recorded stories and interviews by experts and members of the general public. Work so far is showcased on our project website, learningwiththestlawrence.ca. There you'll find highlights of our public outreach projects and the field notes we've commissioned from our artists. I'm particularly proud of these latter, a series of creative interpretations of the river, geolocated by artists working in dance and archival research, drawing, text and video, bookworks, drawings, documentation of site-specific installations, and documentary photography. I hope you'll explore these on our site when you have the chance. The website also includes material about our public outreach events. My team of graduate students and I have been working on events that are informed by the knowledge of the river we glean through our collaborations with our science team members and our own inquiries. These events include October River in the fall of 2021, a series of outdoor Saturday midday art workshops in Point St. Charles that invited people to use media from land art on the left to drawing on the right. In our drawing workshop, for instance, participants learned something about technical basics and were given prompts by the workshop leader, as well as a variety of source photos of the river, including some taken by François Guimet using a drone. At the workshops, the data we collected included photographs of the artworks people created, as well as their stories and comments about their engagement with the river and their hopes for the St. Lawrence's healthy future. Their own art making and artwork became sparks for conversation and connection between us. In July of 2022, we hosted a day of drop-in activities at the Old Port in Trois-Rivières. On the art side, participants drew, wrote poetry, and created cyanotypes or sunprints using sustainably foraged local plants as inspiration. They also took in science demos and visited the labs of the Lampsillus docked alongside. This spring, our public research activity is the River's Threads, Au Fil de Saint-Laurent, a community embroidery project that invites people to join us for stitching and storytelling relating to their relationship with the St. Lawrence. We have created a textile ground using relatively sustainable processes, cyanotype, eco-printing, and natural dyeing, with riverside and other local plants. The plants are our collaborators, offering their form in positive imprints and negative resists, and contributing their chemistry to natural dye formulations. 2 didactic panels and various sample materials explain these low footprint processes. Onto our textile ground, we have drawn light outlines of creatures from the river ecosystems, as well as their names in English, French, and Mohawk. Passers-by are welcome to use these elements as a guide for stitching or to freeform their own contributions. 8 people fit around the stitching frame. Others can choose to work on small individual hoops. Later this week, from June 15th to 18th, we'll have our materials set up under canopy tents alongside the St. Lawrence in Verdun. Our science collaborators will be there with us, offering demos related to water quality and scientific research methods. Anyone who wishes can join us for the embroidery, and we hope that some will agree to a short interview about their relationship with the St. Lawrence and the experience of participating in the stitching. Our participants' work and words are all part of the data that we are collecting, and that starting this autumn, I'll be bringing together in an artwork of my own, integrating statements, images, and ideas from all kinds of sources. As I have continued to learn about and work on river issues, I have grown increasingly concerned about the environmental footprint of the artworks I create. More and more, I am orienting to sustainable and natural processes that reuse and upcycle biodegradable materials into a work that can eventually, someday, decompose without leaving harmful residues on our earth and in the waters. We already have too much e-waste and plastic pollution everywhere on our planet, including in the St. Lawrence River. During the field trip pictured here, our team found these plastic pellets, which Gilbert Cabana informed us are mistaken for food by fish, who starve to death with plastic filling their bellies. We live in complex and challenging times, and just as many of us take pleasure and comfort from the river, from nature, we can also be beset by ecological grief over the losses our planet is experiencing now. But our grief is also a measure of our love, and art, thank goodness, has the emotional range to encompass all the feels, as the saying goes. Philosopher Maxine Greene has suggested that art allows us to hold the chaos of the world at bay while not denying it. I'd like to think that art, especially amplified by science, can enable us to build our tolerance for living with paradox, for engaging with the double-sided coin of love and grief, while we also build the knowledge that will enable us to make good choices for the St. Lawrence River. But the question that I have, much as I love and believe in this collaborative and studio-based work I do, is, does this work make any kind of real difference? Our planet is literally burning. As you know, Canada is currently battling about 400 wildfires, about 120 of those in Quebec. Many are not under control, and the summer fire season is only just beginning. The ecosystem and human devastation is already huge. At times, I'm overwhelmed by the extent and fury of the climate catastrophe we're experiencing. And I wonder whether, from the privilege of the breezy riverside in Verdun, for instance, we aren't simply embroidering while the planet burns, Nero style. My colleagues and I will talk with people who stop in about making better, more ecologically minded individual choices, but that all feels quite minor in the face of the need for rapid and systemic change. As to what difference art can make, this morning, and as brought to me and all of us who subscribe by Hyperallergic, I came across mention of a recent research study that explored the impact of art on climate deniers in the US. This is from May 31st, 2023. Researchers found that artwork that integrated climate data was seen as more convincing than the climate data on its own, and that people who viewed climate data in the form of an artwork were less likely to lean on their preconceived notions. Further, when participants had the opportunity to reflect on their experience with the art, their entrenched positions more readily shifted. They became more accepting of the reality of climate change. This study is, of course, partial, but of course, encouraging for us compelled to do the kind of work we love to do. I still wonder whether the work makes a real difference and how we might better ensure that it does. I honestly don't know, and I'm grateful for other panelists' contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for these really stimulating presentations. I'm not sure what the process is now. Is it just opening up to the questions?
I think what I could do is maybe ask a few questions.
Yes.
I'll just introduce myself. I'm John Latour. I'm the Teaching and Research Librarian for the Fine Arts at Concordia. And I'm also a member of the Elastic Spaces team. So it's my pleasure to ask a bunch of questions. And what I'll do, maybe I'll start with one or two questions, and then we can open it up to see if any of the panelists have questions for each other, or because we have such a nice group of people in the audience, we could open up questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to propose a general question. I noted that many of the panelists explored our relationship to nature through technology. So sensors that are collecting data from trees, the weather, artists sourcing information from the web to inform their art, or even the use of photography or video in their art practice. And a little bit of what Kathleen was saying, I sensed a kind of ambivalence and interest and kind of a caution with the use of technology or eco-based art. I want to ask the panelists if they like to talk a little bit about their relationship with technology. Do they see technology as a solution? Do they see it as a tool? Or is it something else? I am throwing that out now, and I hope somebody will take the baton. Otherwise, I will start pointing to people.
I made my claims, I made my claims already. I mean, technology is not an object. Technology is a relation. And so it can't necessarily be a solution or something that will, it doesn't necessarily solve anything, but it's technology as relation is an opportunity to bring different elements that are different together. And so I totally understand what you're saying, Kathleen, because my artwork is also moved by, I mean, I grew up in the punk era where there was no future already in the 70s. So I decided that I was going to do art because I figured, well, what else am I going to do? I might as well enjoy what I'm doing. But that was a very selfish way of thinking about it. I think that the question of technology, it's most people consider it to be so polarized, but it's really about trying. And I think if I go back to what Kathleen was saying, I think that, you know, this article that's just come out, I mean, there's been so much talk about what's going on with climate change, and we actually have mostly just really, it's catastrophic and it's over anyway. And so what else are we going to do? Are we just going to, you know, take that as being the situation, or are we going to try something? And it doesn't mean that it's going to solve it, but it does mean that it can be of a certain type of experimentation and inspiration. But I can throw that back out to to the others. For me, the tree is a technology. Okay, so it sequesters carbon, it produces oxygen. It's not that humans produce technology, and I think that's extremely l'orgueil. I don't know how you say that. It's the pride of humans, and I think it's working with other ways of being. That's what's technology for me, anyway.
Well, maybe I can interject here very quickly. My confrontation with technology and the subject that has drawn my attention in the last little while, and that's clear cutting of old growth forests. There is technology involved there, sophisticated technology, just absolutely incredible machinery that is designed to cut as much as possible, clear cut actually, in the minimum amount of time. And you probably have heard of feller bunchers, and of course everybody knows about power chainsaws, but feller bunchers, you know, just taking trees, just chopping them like chopsticks essentially. So that's the contact I've had with technology, and trust me, it's very real and it's very devastating. And you know, the tracted machinery leaves just terrible grooves in the topsoil, etc. So the damage is incredible. But I was curious about your presentation and wondering whether what you have been experimenting with would allow you to monitor what happens to these absolutely multi-centennial living organisms when they are cut.
Well, I'm not the scientist in the project. I work with the scientists that are looking at the effects of climate change in the boreal forest. So I'm basically bringing their research into public space. That's my work. I wouldn't know how to answer your question. That would be a good question for them. I know right now there's, it's quite a banal kind of example, but in Montreal, there's a lot of, they add a lot of trees in different containers, and there's a research project going on with one of the researchers from Smart Forests Canada, where they're looking at what is it doing to the tree to be constantly like moved around in these containers, and while it's embellishing the decor, and I'm using that in a very ironic way, what's really going on with the tree. So I think that's maybe somewhat of an answer for you, is that I think that there's monitoring all the time, but that we need more analysis of what's actually happening as well.
For me, I am always gathering information using technology, and to actually wet it into the process for the work that I'm doing right now feels really important. But to watch Kathleen taking a research track and then incorporating it into work and being able to feed it back. We're also using presentations, we're using Zoom, we're using ways to change people's minds. So I think that actually I feel more positive probably from your ending than anything today, Kathleen. But I think there are possibilities with technology that are still quite punk, like getting the word out, seeing these images, seeing these presentations. And I'd be curious to see how, what was your thought process as you sat on that ship and tried to figure out what your role would be?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I would categorize my response to the occasion so much as thought, in the sense that I wasn't sort of cognitively processing so much as experientially absorbing. So their work days are from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The boat moves to a particular location that's identified by GPS technology at work, so they can sample year after year in the same places and identify water quality and fish species. They'll sample, they'll then move to the next location, and while the boat is in motion, the work happens in the lab to do some of either the direct data recovery or to prepare things to be then worked with off site. So I was kind of like the cute mascot, in the sense that I tried to stay out of the way and then do dog's body things when I had the opportunity to do it. And of course I was able to observe the work at hand, which was fascinating. And so I guess what I really understood was the profoundly deep and kind of the deep trough of knowledge that these people had in a very specific specialty. So in the arts, I think, I always think of myself more as a gadfly. I move across subject areas, and while I have deep understanding of certain material practices, I don't have that deep scientific knowledge that is in a specialism. That may be not true of all artists, of course, the way my mind works, but it was fascinating for me to be there, to be looking at the colors of the water, which are, of course, indicative of the source of the water. St. Lawrence is made up of multiple streams from different tributaries, boreal water that comes in quite brown, but is in fact cleaner than a lot of the water that looks clear in the St. Lawrence, specifically if it's downriver of the sewage outflow. It's nowhere near clean, and your body should not be in contact with that water, although it looks clear. So there were interesting things to meditate on and observe, and in conversation with people, understand a little bit through the lens of their eyes, and see how perhaps by working together, we could both expand. They might appreciate some of the more kind of horizon-seeking perspective of the artist rather than the depth-seeking perspective of the scientist, if that's not too broad a generalization. But I think tech is great. I mean, we have to make judicious choices in our use and not update our iPhones every year, obviously, and create more e-waste. But the sampling that the scientists do couldn't happen without the technology that's highly specialized and allows it. And I do really appreciate that we can have Natasha with us by Zoom. Thank you for making that choice of staying there and keeping your footprint smaller, as much as I would love to have you here and talk to you a lot about all of the work that you're doing.
Perhaps we could check in with Natasha to see if she had something to add.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to kind of reference what Yves was saying about the technology and in the logging industry, because it's interesting how technology is definitely used by the logging industry to, maximize extraction, but also it's used by the forest protectors as well. Like the Fairy Creek blockade couldn't have been what it was without, people having remote internet access, ironically purchasing the, Elon Musk Starlink satellite dishes, people, being able to post content online, sharing what was happening out there in a very remote area that has no cell service with basically the world. And not only that, I mean, like staying safe out in the forest. So the work that I did I bring my phone with me, which I have an app that is an offline map, so I can see the terrain, I can see where I am. With photos, having GPS markers on each photo I take, so I can go back to the same location and kind of see how things have changed, like the circles that I made on the ground. I went back to the same place, and it was completely decimated, like basically because of the feller bunchers that Yves mentions that destroys the soil and it's unrecognizable. So a lot of the technology that we have access to can be used in really like generative ways and ways to connect. But then at the same time, there's a lot of techno fixes, right? And a lot of these ideas that we can solve the climate crisis through technology, which is a real fallacy when you really look at the data. Carbon scrubbing for the atmosphere, like the amount of energy that it takes to use these machines that literally take carbon out of the atmosphere and then put it somewhere, and where does it go? And it's just it's such a huge puzzle. And I feel like technology is an absolutely necessary part of the complex puzzle that, of tools and methods that we have available to us, to work together. But it needs to be approached with I think a lot of mindfulness about, the ripple effect of how we're using the technology, for sure.
Well, I'd just like to add, just because if we consider the tree a technology, if we consider elders, indigenous as technologies, as techniques, I think we're sort of missing something to always embed it in an object. I think that it's unfortunate to think that way, because it doesn't permit new ways of thinking about it. And when I say thinking, it's really about experience. It's not that the mind is separate from the body at all. And so these new experiences can enable new ways of being. And so again, I'm not saying technology as we've discussed it up to now, as an object, as a computer, as an internet link it is also technology, but it's not the only technology. And I think that's what I'm arguing for in this project, when I'm trying to develop this concept of eco-technologies of practice, is that it is the combined effort as much of trees as flora, fauna, peoples, and machines. And so it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work, but it doesn't prevent us from trying. And I think, again, for me, it's an occasion to counter dominant discourse around the catastrophes, constant catastrophes. So I'd just like to throw that out again, because some of you are in contact with the elders, and I think the techniques of living is also a technology. So would you mind commenting on that?
Well, my inclination would be to refer to, and I'm just from settler origins in the old colony of New France, so I would not purport to speak for elders or for First Nations. But what I have found in my research is that, and it's actually acknowledged by our governments, that there is precious indigenous culture and traditions and knowledge. And that knowledge is based on the notion, and a very practical notion of that all things are interconnected. So in that sense, I think I reach your concept. To me, the word technology doesn't quite relate to that. It's the interconnection and the fact that we are all a part of this great Mother Nature, or whichever way you want to describe it or call it, and that there is no alternative but to act in concertation, all of us, in harmony with nature. And we have lost that dimension, unfortunately, through the industrial extraction of resources.
Thank you.
I have one more question to ask before I open it up to the floor. I think all of our panelists, we can consider researchers in one respect or another. A number of visual artists are doing research creation, perhaps might identify their own practice as research creation, a kind of overlap between visual arts or arts and academic research. Yves, I think the work that you do is very much involved with legal research and historical research. I'm just curious to know how the work that you do is received by the different communities that you work with. How do scientists react to the visual arts aspects of your work? Or how do artists or the arts community, or even the general public, how do they respond to this sort of scientific, or should I say technological approaches to your work? So I'm very curious to know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I can definitely talk, but I'll pass. I can talk later. Kathleen, maybe you want to talk.
Sure, thanks. I'd love to hear from others as well. I'd say there's generally a positive response to the work that I do in collaboration with so many others, including scientists and members of the public. I do find that in the community outreach work, people are really delighted to have the opportunity to do something, to create something. Many people who do not designate themselves as artists do wonderfully creative things in their lives, but they don't often have the opportunity to sit down for 15 minutes or an hour and just do something for the sheer living hell of it that relates to something they may feel passionately about, which could be the St. Lawrence River. So I hear a lot about, thank you for this opportunity. There's a lot of curiosity about what I'm hearing and what people are expressing. There's a lot of desire to know more, and particularly a desire to have something to do that makes a difference. I'd say the arts, the kind of events that I do with the public, that can be nourishing and encouraging on an inner level. We can share some information such as don't buy clothing that has polyester in it if you can avoid it, because that will reduce to plastics in your wash and in the water and in your bloodstream. But I think people really want to be able to make a difference in their own way. And so the work starts to open tiny moments where they perhaps feel they can do so. And I hope they take many more moments in the rest of their lives.
And Kathleen, before you pass the microphone, and just the sciencey people that you work with, if I can say that, how do they respond to the work?
They are fascinated because it doesn't necessarily reflect how they would choose to engage, but they really appreciate the opportunity, particularly when we do things in common. And so we're planning what they will do at various events. And so I say, okay, make sure you have something that a child can touch with no danger. And it's like, oh, so there are ways to think about sort of through the prism of different practices. So I think that, they're highly creative people in their own worlds. And I've been very warmly welcomed into their communities. And they wouldn't have done that had they not been deeply interested in the arts and in what we may be able to build together. So I'm very fortunate. I guess, Gisèle, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. Well, the practice that I do for several years now, it's like 3 decades, is called AE Lab. And we work with, other artists, philosophers, engineers, scientists, and each project enables to have this meeting ground. And often we come to the work because we're concerned, we're worried, and we want to know how other people are working on these same subjects. And I think that's really the brilliant side of the St. Lawrence or the question of the landscape in Canada, is that we share that concern, but then we have our different ways of expressing it. And so the wonderful thing that I have with the chair this time is that it's a long-term relationship. It's 5 years. And before maybe we worked 8 months or a couple of weeks or something like that. Now it's much more long-term. And it's just really building constantly. And also through a lot of discussion. And what I try to make happen now is that it's the beginning of the project. everybody's sitting around the table, and it's not the artist coming in at the end that's supposed to, you know, make it public or something. And in my own, let's say, challenges, I really wanted to do things outside. I didn't want to do it in a museum or in a gallery anymore. And what did that entail? That entailed like just, wow, like how to do that. And then the validity of the research is not just picking like anything you find online, you're actually creating another relation. And so very, very touched by that. And then the people, we do also semi-directed interviews. And so the public, you know, again, that we feel most of the time that everyone's downtrodden and they, you know, they don't know what to do. The conversations have been extremely engaging and really open and really honest too. And so I needed that. I needed to be, let's say, just outside of a strictly art community. And I'm just, yeah, I'm just happy to be able to do it. I'm thankful to be able to do that and get challenged as well. So.
I haven't had the privilege of working on such a grand scale, but I've been really fascinated by my research and seeing links between government policy, between the development of culture in Canada, funding, and how all of these things are really intertwined with supporting industry and industrial development. And that culture has really been a very useful tool, which through that research is that's what I'm trying to question, is how do we untangle this, or how do we, and I think it's through work and Tasha's work, that we try and untangle this and have a greater role in making change. But also, as you were saying, Yves, we need to work together because the forces have been working together historically and politically for a really long time. So we need to figure out how to have as much power through our actions and the work that we do.
Yeah, and staying open, I think, is a crucial aspect.
Yves, would you like to say something?
I'll try to be brief. Well, my background has been law and business, and it's something totally unrelated to the forests and the environment. So it was in communications, telecommunications, and broadcasting. So what brought me to this field, which is totally new to me, was actually just driving on the west coast of Vancouver Island and seeing those massive clear cuts that have been there for many, many years, and nothing is growing back on them. And there's a thin ribbon forest in what is now called the Juan de Fuca Provincial Park. There's a trail there, but you know, the appearances are there, but if you're driving on that road, you see a kind of very different story. So that's where it all comes from. And what can I say? Well, you know, I went quickly through my slide on the 5-point strategy, and one of the elements is networking, coordination, and focus. So I think we need to network everyone in there: artists, activists, social sciences, political sciences, economics, you name it. Yeah. Let's network. And you know, I'm just out of a summer class at Simon Fraser University on radical democracy. I wanted to find out if there were any other, you know, interesting ideas on how to actually reappropriate our democracy. And I think that we're at the cusp of having to do that because we're all running out of time.
We could check in again with Natasha. Natasha, do you have any?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to your question. So I've shown my work to bryologists, so like moss scientists, lichenologists, and ecologists, and the feedback I've gotten has been generally positive and appreciative. You know, with the biosphere project, what I was doing was actually a form of what's called an ecology genetic rescue, which is actually moving species to a new area before their home gets destroyed in order to preserve genetic diversity in the population. which is usually done with mammals, but in this case, I was doing it with mosses and the plants that live in them. So the bryologist I showed this to, he did not pick up on the sort of subtle messaging that I tried to integrate of the sort of boundary between like an act of harm and an act of care, and kind of putting myself in a position as an extension of, colonial destruction, even though I was there for purpose of reciprocity. He kind of just saw it purely as a documentation of, moving moss. And even that's still okay to me, because he still appreciated the fact that the project was kind of bringing attention to the other forest beings who are, integral to the health of the forest, that are, part of this really complex, connected, as, as we've heard already today, technology, essentially, these beings have, established ways of interconnecting and supporting each other. And that kind of relates to the Pachita worldview, that everything is one and everything is connected. I showed the project to Elder Bill Jones of the Pachita First Nation, and he was really uplifted by the final installation of moving that moss and having it all be alive. But at the same time, he did feel that that almost violence of digging up the moss. And when we first looked at it together before I'd finished the installation, he was kind of like, it's like you're moving the children of the forest. It was a really disturbing, and I felt that. I mean, when I was working on the project, it did feel really uncomfortable, and I wasn't sure if what I was doing was okay. And I'm still not fully sure. But it's really important, I think, to like frame this as like a conversation about sort of these ethical dilemmas that we encounter when we're trying to find local solutions to like various ecological problems. I talked to loggers many times, ran into loggers while I was working. They were at the far end of the cut block and I was at the other end. And I told them what I was doing, and a lot of them thought it was really interesting. Some of them were kind of like, okay, sure, but a lot of them actually really responded well. One of them even came to the screening, and then I showed the project to someone I know from Fairy Creek, and he was kind of like, man, that's some white savior, kind of thing. And I was like, I appreciate that, because I think that's a really important conversation to have, like talking about at what point are, is that kind of something that could be read into the work, and how to orient the work in a way that does not have that. And maybe there isn't a way. I mean, maybe that's going to come up for some people no matter what. And I'm okay with that. For me, the project's not just about, it's definitely about finding ways to help these, these mosses, but it's also a lot about my own, experience of witnessing the destruction around me. And even though I'm somewhat complicit in it, for my own, sanity and dealing with the ecological grief that I have, it's a way to work through that in a practical, hands-on way. So, and then with the invasive plant removal that I showed at the very end, there were actually some teens who saw that circle from the hillside, and they kind of called out to me. They were on their bikes and they were like, hey, that's really cool. And I was like, thanks. And then they started talking amongst themselves about like, I wonder why that yellow plant's taken over like that. And so I think there's a whole multi-level, conversation going on. And I feel like the connections that can be made through art with just random people in the public, and even, resource extraction workers, as well as, Indigenous, First Nations, community members and scientists, like we're all going to be affected. Like we are all currently affected by, climate change. And I feel like art's definitely a really useful, and for me, like the only way that I can figure that I can really sort of address this in a effective way, even if what I'm doing isn't actually making that much of a difference. Like I feel like everybody's contributing in some way, hopefully in whatever way they can. Anyway, I'm rambling. So thanks.
That was great. Thank you so much. Thank you. I think it might be a good opportunity now to ask some questions of our audience. I don't know. We have 2 microphones here. I could do a Phil Donahue, if anyone knows who that is. All right. I don't know who Phil Donahue is, I swear. I will come to the audience. Do we have any people who would like to ask a question? Oh, great. Thank you. Phil, thanks.
Hi. My question is for Shelley. Have you had any interaction, positive or negative, with the photographers who you have used their photos to create your embroidery?
I have not reached out to the photographers at all. I do try and name them if I know them, but oftentimes they're not named, but I do name the source. So as I was very clear that they came from the websites, and then I've altered the images. And actually, I think it would be a great thing if there was a challenge around that. But these are pretty much public domain on the websites. Sometimes, particularly with Chris McIntosh's image, that image is named, but it's a stock photography image. So I do have some background working in stock photography. And so that is a little bit of where the history of my interest in image and pushing copyright comes from. So thank you for that question.
I see that we have someone online who has a question. Perhaps we could ask Damon Matthews to ask their question. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I don't really have a question, but I wanted to add my support to what everyone is talking about today. I mean, I am a climate scientist. I work, I've been working in climate modeling, and so I recognize that this is a position of privilege, and also that grants me certain authority to speak on things, and yet I also feel that sometimes that I wonder what am I doing and how is it actually making a difference? And there's so much evidence that science by itself does not change hearts and minds. And really the climate crisis demands, a change in hearts and minds of the world. And more scientific data is not going to do that. And so I assure you that, many scientists working in this field also, have this sense of like, what are we doing and how is it actually making a difference? And so I want to kind of endorse or applaud you all for what you're doing and say that it is important and that art is one of those ways that can change individual hearts and minds, and that's such an important piece of the overall challenge. I also had just a thought to add to this question of technology, if that's okay. And someone said that technology won't solve the climate crisis, and that's absolutely true. Intention and effort will solve the climate challenge, but any job is made so much easier if you have the right tool, and this is where technology is so important. And so I think kind of understanding the technological landscape and the tools that are available to us, from artistic expression to AI and machine learning, is a really critical challenge for all of us to be able to access the right tool to make the job easier. So thanks, that's all.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions from the audience or from the panelists that they'd like to pose? I thought I had seen someone. No. Do the panelists have questions for?
Actually, would like to know about the 5 that you were going to talk about in your presentation. Your 5.
Without getting back into the slideshow, I've given a little bit of thought to what's possible. I don't know why this comes to mind, but when I was a student here at Montreal, there were T-shirts out there. It was the effervescent '60s. I'm an old guy, so there was a T-shirt that was being sold there at the bookstores, and it was a quote apparently from Che Guevara. It says, "Soyons réalistes, exigeons l'impossible." So let's be realistic. Let's ask for the impossible. But I have a different version, a different perspective now, having much matured and going through all kinds of travails. I would say let's be realistic. Let's ask for the possible now. So that's where I take it from. So I tried to come out with some kind of an overall strategy of how do we get progress? How do we manage to get some real meaningful change? And the 5 points are, first of all, grassroots mobilization and involvement. It all starts, or it should start, from the bottom and trickle up, not start from the top and trickle down. So that's the first element. I don't know I don't want to belabor the point, but I had a little statement for each one of them, but I'll go through the various points. So the next one, and I've talked about it already, is networking, coordination, and focus. Because we need all competencies, we need all disciplines, we need anything that can bring, how should I say, an emotional response, because we are, let's face it, constantly desensitized to a lot of things, including this issue of climate change. Then information, research, and data resources. I'm particularly worried coming out, particularly of a summer class, about where we are headed on the reliability and availability information. I don't know if any of you have had experience with governments on freedom of information or access to information. It's really going downhill. It's become extremely difficult, extremely barricaded. But an even bigger threat is the use of artificial intelligence to manipulate information and to actually control the access to the information that is truly meaningful. So we all have a responsibility to do that on our own and to pool that, which is reliable, which is true, and which is thought-provoking, not just commercially oriented. Then communications and public relations. We all know how important it is to communicate. We all know the problem with traditional media, and I come from a background of traditional media, so there's this movement to reappropriate the media, and there are some media out there that are not traditional. They need support. I contribute to a number of local media because I think they're doing a hell of a good job exposing the key issues that we have to deal with, and a lot of the information that doesn't come out on the more established media. And then what I call non-political action. So what does that mean? Well, there's power in driving the agenda for policy, social, economic, and political platforms, governance and compliance, and there is strength in exposing prevarication, and undue influence. So I have to be aware of the fact that there is a lot of co-opting and a lot of capture of the government apparatus, whether it's federal or provincial or even local, by private interests. And I'm not necessarily totally opposed to a dialogue between government and private interests, but I'm very concerned about exclusive access by private interests to the government and to government structures.
Is that what you're calling radical democracy? Yeah.
Well, as a librarian, I was totally impressed with your interest in reliable information resources. So, but all of the 5 points were really fantastic. And it actually reminded me, you also reminded us that we're in a university context as well. And I thought it might be good to ask the panelists perhaps what advice or strategies they might have for emerging artists who are interested in working with ecological issues or ecology in their art. Do you have any strategies or advice that you could give emerging artists? I like to ask very simple questions.
Well, maybe I can address that. What I've been trying to do at my university is do things between the faculties, and it's been really hard. It just doesn't happen easily because it's so entrenched in the disciplines. But I do think that these research groups enable to bypass the programs and bring people together that are, again, concerned about these very same issues, about the St. Lawrence, about what is our representation of nature, about what are the legal issues around it. I have pined for it at my university, but I was only able to do it within research creation and not in the program itself. So what I would say to students is, get involved. Myself as a research chair, I'm actually kind of like a big project manager. And bringing the students in enables them to see how do you do those kind of projects, and how do you get involved with the different disciplines. And I'm just so thankful again to be able to do that, because even if there's interdisciplinarity within the arts, and I think that that's become much more accessible now, we still have a long way to go between the other disciplines, like precisely with economics and legal issues and science, the sciences. So for the students, I think if there are students that are interested in these issues, I think it's what Latour calls the boundary object. It's like, for me, it's the tree, it's the forest, which is, I won't say that it's immediate that people are attracted to that, but I mean, there is kind of a premise that will enable something to happen because it's an aggregator. And so same thing, St. Lawrence, I mean, we live next to this fantastic body of water, and so pulling all of those expertises together and sharing them is something that will be extremely beneficial, I think. So I would suggest again to the students to claim those kinds of programs in their different fields, that there is crossover, and I think that would be really great.
I would echo that from the other perspective of someone that went back to school to invigorate a practice, a long-standing practice, and to have access to folks like yourselves. I know it's a very privileged position to be in school, but suddenly you have access to incredible library resources. You have access to incredible resources, equipment, and all of these things really invigorate and open your mind up again. So I think for students to try and participate in as many areas as possible is really helpful. But then I also think that what Tasha is doing on the groundwork, and very interesting. And we had some classes together, and I know that this is not new surprise this year from COVID. Tasha's been committed before she came to school to environmental activism, and this has been more focused. And that was my experience as well, that the research, you have an opportunity to focus in while meeting other folks.
Yeah, what I say to my students all the time is use the institution. So there are people here, great resources, access to equipment, old style digital tech, maybe some trees, but certainly some digital tech that you might not be able to afford. So use the institution to further your own heart's desires and ambitions. It is something I always say. But I also would suggest, going back to your plan in a certain way, organize. Students can be incredibly powerful and persuasive, and can sometimes affect change in ways that we just can't. We get stuck in committees, or we have this form to fill out, and no, that wasn't the right form, it was this form. And so we get bogged down in ways that students can often bypass. So I would say organize collectively, work together where you can, work individually where you're passionate about it, but used your collective power. And also think about how you can push forward a sustainability agenda within the institution. Because there's work that every university can do, most of them are doing, to make the institution itself a more sustainable creature, to divest fossil fuel investments, to be more mindful about the materials that we use. So I would say push on that side too. Make your temporary home place a better place from a sustainability and environmental perspective.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to this question, as an emerging artist myself, I don't really feel like I'm in a position to give advice to other emerging artists. But one thing that I have recognized, at least in my own approach, that's been helpful is alongside the processes of, using the institution's facilities and libraries, is also making sure I go outside. And I kind of quote Elder Bill Jones, where it's like, go out into the forest, connect with the ecosystem around you, learn about it, firsthand, go to the riverside, watch the seasons change, have a better understanding of where you are. Because I think a lot of the climate change solutions that we're going to, be developing together are often local, local scale, and not just climate change, but biodiversity. The biodiversity crisis is interconnected with the climate change one. And yeah, I think definitely, having an embodied connection with the environment while, being in an institution like university helps kind of bridge that, the head, right? Like the head on a research, all that kind of stuff with like the human, like the animal, because we are, we're part of the biosphere. We are animals. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we're in the position we're in, is because we've created, we as in, Western society has created this idea of nature, which Timothy Morton says is like one of the most destructive ideas that's ever been, invented. This idea that nature is somehow this separate entity. And so, yeah. And then also with, students who maybe graduate, like I just graduated, but also I've been doing my degree mostly remotely in a settlement that doesn't even have a grocery store, and I have to drive 45 minutes to the nearest gas station. And I appreciate everything Concordia has to offer, but there's also a lot of local colleges and universities in your town. Like I got a community membership to the UVic library. And as a community member, you can take out so many books. You can access online journal articles, like just because you graduate, just because you're no longer a student, or if you don't have the privilege of being a student, there's so much available to you as a community member. And I think that's really important to share, because I know that not everyone has the chance to experience the amazing opportunities that universities have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll check in with the audience, both in presence and online, to see if there are any more questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? I see a hand raised. Thank you.
Hi, it's Jorge. It's a question for Natasha. I see that you work with the moss and cutting out the circles. I can't tell how secluded they are. Is this work that you want the public to walk and go see, or are you doing it almost in a secret location? What's that relationship with that?
That is a really great question. I think I mostly chose the location because of its proximity to where I live, which is really remote. I chose it because it was a pending cut block. It was right around the time I wanted to work on this project. It was pending, and then 3 days later, after I became acquainted with it, it shifted to approved, and they started cutting. And so, it was strategic mostly, moving. There's quite a process of deciding where to finally, build a new home for the moss so that it would stay alive. You know, ideas around just the shifting, like I said in my earlier experiment with this process, you know, the forest beside a clear cut changes completely because of the you know, the moisture and the sun exposure shift. And so, you know, I mostly chose it for what is best for the moss, you know, what is going to be most effective. And at the same time, you know, it is a difficult to access spot. That's not necessarily intentional. I have a little trail that goes down to it, but part of it's somewhat steep. And, you know, if people want to go see it, I'm happy to show them, but you know, and depending on, you know, the person's intentions, you know, I'm happy to like share the coordinates, but it's not really meant to be like a destination, you know, like some of these land art installations. It's not, that's not really the purpose, even though I know that maybe limits how many people can experience it. Yeah, so it's a tricky one. And also, you know, like the idea of like impact on the environment of lots of people going there, impact on the creek, it's right beside the creek. You know, I don't have, and I'll be totally transparent, I didn't follow, you know, the proper sort of Indigenous Pacheedaht protocol of like looking for community consent for doing this project. And there are reasons I didn't do that, partly because there's you know, it's a tricky, very tricky situation right now in the Pacheedaht First Nation around logging, and I didn't feel that it was the right time to sort of engage in a collaborative relationship. But, you know, I tried to do this respectfully. And so, you know, partly because of that, I don't feel like it's, you know, I don't feel like I'm entitled to like bring a bunch of people there to show them. So, you know, it's a really tricky situation. And I'm not really sure exactly how I'm going to approach it going forward. I think I'm going to sort of see what happens, but it was definitely both trying to prioritize the, you know, the moss's well-being as well as, you know, creating something that I could share through using technology, actually. So yeah, thank you for that question, Jorge.
Thank you. I think maybe I'll just ask one more question, and I'll ask it to Gisèle, if that's all right. Earlier you mentioned care, the concept of care. I just heard the concept of well-being. Made me think of empathy, for instance. I guess my question, a general question is, could you talk a little bit more about this concept of care? I personally think the notion of empathy is also very important as well, and it's opposite, apathy, in relation to environmental issues. Could you expand a little more on care?
I don't know if I talked about that, but,
I'm sorry.
but that's okay. I'd like to broach it through the question of sympathy and more than empathy. I think empathy invariably roots it into human as that kind of propels you towards caring for something external. But if you talk about it in terms of sympathy, it's that it's actually shared. There's not one that overrides the other, that's in a shared situation. And these are I take this from Donna Haraway because she talks about the sympoietic, which is a shared reality, shared production of reality, realities. And so if you're in a sympathy, well, for example, I mean, and I don't see this as something being servile, but I couldn't exist without the tree. I couldn't exist without the oxygen, which is actually a byproduct, a garbage of the tree that enables me to live, you know? So I'm really interested in that. And what gets shared at certain points in time in certain situations. And so if we bring that into care, I did hear that in many of the presentations today. The question of care is that you want to be careful, I would say, caring, but is that necessarily a human trait? I think it is, but I'm not sure. I haven't really delved into that. Maybe someone else can respond.
I think all kinds of creatures care between species as well as for their own species. So I think there's lots of documentation of that. I do a lot of work in dog rescue, so I see a certain aspect of that, but yeah.
I think I sort of wanted to step back a little bit around it. We didn't really discuss an idea of nature, of what we're talking about. I mean, Natasha is living in what would be seen as nature, but I think we also have nature in the pots out on the boulevard. And
this is also nature.
Right.
We could say that. It all comes from nature.
Right, right. So
even if we disagree.
Right.
Yeah.
So this this vast terminology is something that I really sort of struggle with, because I mean, that very first image that I showed, that was not a place for me. There was nobody in that image, but especially not me. That's what I always felt with. So there's an interesting thing when we are thinking about care and where we belong, and how we've been conditioned to utilize things for self-care, and trying to flip our brains around that we actually have to care, for broader, beyond our own species, for our world. So I think your project is really interesting in creating visible evidence, I guess, for care or tapping into it.
Well, I think we all need to care, because as I said earlier, that's my personal view anyways, we're all interconnected. Okay, so we need to, in all our processes and the way that we act in this post-industrial world, we need to get a sense that we have to care beyond ourselves. And of course, the dynamics of the way we operate markets, etc., is really to care in a very limited way for certain results that lead to what we observe now that are huge problems for all of us interconnected people. So that we have to unlearn and relearn. And can I leave you with a message for all the age groups that are hopefully represented here, but we're in a university setting. In one of my slides, I said, seniors, take responsibility for past complacency, get involved, and give back time, money, and know-how to make a stand for change. That's what I'm trying to do personally. I'm an old guy. Now, Gen X and Y and Z, don't repeat the mistakes of your forebears, and work to bring change in your workplace and your communities. I know it's hard, you're busy, you got all kinds of demands, but spare a little bit of time to do that. Millennials, take charge of the agenda for change, because your immediate future is at stake. And then the young who have not made it to university yet, I say, learn, develop your skills and your passion for nature, a clean, fair, sustainable, and responsible use of your planet's resources, and how to be constant gardeners.
Natasha, I don't know if you can top that, but if you have any.
Gardening is a technology.
Any final thoughts on that, Natasha?
I think what everyone said is really poignant, and I guess I would just reiterate what I said earlier about this idea that somehow we've imagined that we're separate from nature, and the idea that taking care of our ecosystems, our natural systems, is self-care, and kind of trying to find ways of communicating that, so different people will shift their perspective, and I really loved the project where you're showing the sentience of the trees. I think that's really that's just so powerful, and anything that can reach people to just start seeing our biosphere neighbors and you know, the beings that surround us as, yeah, also sort of caring in a way, or feeling, or, you know, maybe that's anthropomorphizing things, but, you know, if that's what needs to be done, I'm fine. People can anthropomorphize away if it means that people are going to be more responsible with, you know, recognizing how actions and relationships are affecting, you know, everything that's in our connected web.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for answering all of my pesky questions, and you gave some very thoughtful and interesting answers, and you've generated more questions, I think, as well. So that's all great. So I'm going to pass the baton back to you.
Well, thanks to you, John. Thanks to you, John, for being our respondent. And thanks to everyone for coming today. And we're looking forward to more conversations. And merci, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to everybody who came in person and online to this event this afternoon. We're going to close up the Zoom. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you all so much.